So this month, we have been dealing with the theme of resistance. We've talked about or heard about inner resistance. We've heard about creative resistance. And today, I'd like to talk about public spaces and public art and the ways in which they either resist the values of our society or reinforce them. And so I'd like to begin with this metal sculpture of a peace sign. It stands outside the Van Pelt Library at the University of Pennsylvania campus. And in 1969, a professor protesting US participation in Vietnam shimmied up this huge flagpole to bring the American flag down to half staff. In response, the Pennsylvania legislature threatened to withdraw the $27 million that it gave annually to the university if the flag was not restored to full staff. And as a compromise, the student affairs leaders offered to raise the money for this sculpture, and it was created by a professor of fine arts at the university and 8 of his students. The sculpture is still there, and it has become a space for demonstrations and resistance to social injustice. Ron Mauser shared both the picture and the story with me, and so I thank him for sharing that, because I think it offers a nice entree into our topic today. So I'm quite sure that everybody here has been to a public space that is devoted to honoring and remembering soldiers and war. Such spaces are so numerous in our society, it's impossible to believe that someone could not have been in such a place at least once. We've all gone to an event at a Veterans Memorial Stadium, or we've driven on a Veterans Memorial Highway, or we've gone to a city park with some sort of weapon like the cannon down in Riverside Park, or a tank, or at the very least, a wall of names of people who died in a war. These celebrations of war and the military just surround us. But when was the last time that you were in a public space that was explicitly devoted to peace and to people who worked and died for peace? That's a little bit of a harder thing, because peace spaces and public art dedicated to peace are both less common and less obvious in our society than spaces dedicated to war. So today, I'd like us to take a few minutes to think about our public spaces. What do we fill our public spaces with? How we design and fill our public spaces is very important, because our created environment shapes our understanding of reality. It reinforces certain values by making them visible, and it undermines other values by making them invisible. So here's a question for you. What would it feel like to live in a world where public spaces that celebrated peace and peacemakers were at least as prevalent and common as those dedicated to war? A world where for every tank in a city park, there was also a peace sculpture. Where for every Veterans Memorial Highway, there was a Peace Corps Memorial Bridge. Where for every wall of names of dead soldiers, there was a wall of names of people who died working for peace. Michael Knox believes that that would be a world in which there were fewer wars. In 2005, he was visiting Washington, D.C. with his son, and he was struck by the fact that in the midst of all the war memorials that are on the National Mall, there was not a single national memorial to celebrate those who worked and died for peace. And he wrote, "These war memorials exist to reinforce the notion that war efforts are highly valued in our society, but there are no national monuments here to convey a message that our society also values peace. There is no public validation of anti-war activities and no memorial to serve as a catalyst for discussion about the courageous peace efforts by Americans over the past centuries. And this inspired him to create the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation to raise support and funding for just such a memorial that he hopes one day will be on the National Mall. Such a monument would represent resistance to the dominant narrative in our society that war and militarism are necessary solutions to our problems. And by the way, if you're interested in finding out more about the U.S. Peace Memorial, there are flyers in the coffee area. Feel free to take one after the service. But it's not just that the number of war spaces is so great and the number of peace spaces is so small. It's also that our understanding of peace tends to be fuzzy and ambivalent, and we reflect that fuzziness and ambivalence in our public spaces. So let me give you an example that comes from the Village Park in Bangor, Wisconsin, just up the highway. In May of 2002, about 40 people gathered in the back corner of the park to witness the dedication of what was called a permanent peace memorial. Next slide, please. The memorial was a flagpole after about a 20-minute service, a peace flag was raised. It was striking to me that this was called a permanent peace memorial because flagpoles can be removed with relative ease, and the peace flag, the only part of the memorial that explicitly talked about peace, could be replaced by another flag with a very different message. And so this permanent peace memorial, in fact, felt very temporary to me, all the more so because on the other side of the park, at the entrance, next slide, please, is a tank. Clearly a very permanent war memorial. And this seemed to me to be an apt metaphor for the ways we think about peace and war in our society. We see war as sturdy and tangible and unambiguous and permanent, like a tank. And peace is as ephemeral and vague and fragile as a piece of cloth hanging from a flagpole. Now, since 2002, there have been additions to both the war and the peace spaces in the Bangor Park. Next slide, please. Next to the tank now sit a wall of names of Bangor residents who have died in war. And next slide, please. And a military helicopter. Next to the peace flag are two metal sculptures celebrating soccer and music, collectively called Soccer Song. John McHugh, the driving force behind the Peace Memorial, argues that music and sports can help bring about harmony and cooperation in the world. Next slide, please. In his words, this particular sculpture, the soccer part of Soccer Song, symbolizes the hope that the youth of the world who come together today to share in a friendly game of soccer will become the leaders of tomorrow who will learn to share the world. And you can see it's a globe that's sort of a soccer ball, but it's also a globe, and there's a peace dove underneath it. The next slide, please. This is the song part of the memorial. The other sculpture celebrates music as an international language. It's a metal piano, and the word imagine there calls to mind the song by the Beatles, Imagine. McHugh described the process of adding the elements, the war and the peace elements, to this park as a kind of quiet and respectful dialogue. But I think it's noteworthy that the Peace Memorial is intentionally located in the back corner of the park. McHugh said, "We purposely set them back there away from everything else so that they would be somewhat secluded." That's a very interesting statement. This may make the Peace Memorial more peaceful because it's in this section of the park that few people go to, and so you can go there for quiet and solitude. But it also makes it less noticeable and less likely for people to see than the military monuments that are not only right at the entrance to the park, as I mentioned before, but they are next to a playground picnic area that is popular with children and families. And so the physical locations of these monuments reinforce the idea that peace is marginal, it's ephemeral, it's secondary, war is important, it's mainstream, it's right up front. Next slide, please. We find similar challenges, this fuzziness, this vagueness about thinking about peace, this ambiguity in thinking about peace. We find those similar challenges with the International Peace Garden on the North Dakota-Manitoba border. It was created in 1932 to celebrate the long-standing friendship between Canada and the United States. And it was the brainchild of Dr. Henry Moore, a Canadian horticulturalist, who envisioned this Eden-like space that would contain plants from all over the world. Like the Bangor Park, it has evolved over time, and by 2020, it contained flower beds and fountains, picnic areas, spaces for music and sports camps, a Masonic lodge in front of which stand the 10 Commandments, written in stone, and of course, the requisite gift shop. There's also an historical interpretation center that talks about the creation of the garden, but not about friendship between Canada and the United States. A nurse's plot with a plaque inscribed with the Florence Nightingale Pledge, a museum with exhibits on wildlife law enforcement and conservation of natural resources, a 9/11 memorial, and up until its demise in 2017, a peace tower representing, quote, early immigrants' soaring ambitions. So the overall effect is this hodgepodge of messages and images that can't help but cause one to ask what in the world the creators meant by peace. And how does all of this relate to friendly relations between Canada and the United States? In this cacophony of messages, the garden becomes pretty much just a lovely green space, popular with picnics and school field trips and wedding parties. Next slide, please. This confusion is well demonstrated in the Peace Chapel, whose walls are inscribed with 59 quotations from so-called people of peace. And these include quotations like one from Franklin Roosevelt, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Or Sir William Osler, "Live neither in the past nor in the future, but let each day's work absorb all your interest, energy, and enthusiasm." Inspiring words to live by, perhaps, but what do they have to do with peace? It's also noteworthy that in this melange of statements, peace statements from people all over the world, there is not a single one from a Native American, even though the garden is located in the Turtle Mountains, home of the Chippewa, Dakota, and Ojibwe peoples, and according to First Nations legend, it has been a traditional summer gathering spot for peaceful discussion and resolution of conflicts for millennia. Fortunately, in the fall of 2020, a group began a process of contemplating how they could address some of these shortcomings. And that process is actually resulting in some significant improvements that will make this space much more directly related to peace. So it's helpful that that will take place, although for the first 90 plus years of its existence, it didn't seem to say much at all about peace. It seems to me that the basic problem was that the creators failed to think deeply about what they meant by peace. And that's, in some ways, it's not too surprising, because peace is something that we all think we know what it is, but it can be really hard to define. It can mean a lot of different things. It can go from, personal inner tranquility all the way on the other end of the scale to the absence of violent international conflict. and everything in between. And the other thing that's tricky about peace, or another thing that's tricky about peace, is that working for peace can lead to conflict. Because in order to achieve true peace, you have to establish justice. And that frequently means challenging the status quo. And so when a public space tries to move us closer to true peace, and thus to true justice, it can step on some pretty powerful toes, and that can cause conflict. Next slide, please. We have a great example of this in Seoul, South Korea. This is a life-size bronze statue of a barefoot teenage girl in traditional Korean dress, sitting in a chair, staring straight ahead. It's called Peace Monument, but it has been at the center of an ongoing controversy between South Korea and Japan that has gone on for years. And part of the reason is because of its location, directly across from the Japanese embassy. It is intended to be a silent but relentless reminder of the hundreds of thousands of women and girls, some as young as 10 years old, whom the Japanese military used as comfort women or sexual slaves during World War II. When the monument was installed in December 2011, the Japanese government asked that it be removed. But it remains, and it continues to promote controversy rather than establishing peace. But in the process, it has also spurred an international dialogue about Japan's role in World War II and the larger issues of war crimes and the violation of human rights. Next slide, please. The Mexican artist Pedro Reyes has also sought to speak truth to power. In 2008, he created Palas por Pistolas, or Shovels for Guns, in Culiacan, the city with the highest rate of handgun deaths in Mexico. With the help of local officials, he collected 1,527 guns from civilians, then publicly crushed them with a steamroller, took them to a foundry, melted them down, and created 1,527 shovels, which he sent around the world to plant 1,527 trees, also in very public places. Swords into plowshares. Next, oh, thank you. In 2012, he traveled to the very dangerous Ciudad Juarez to confront global civilian warfare and the illicit arms trafficking that kills people every single day. Using parts from 6,700 confiscated weapons, he worked with local artisans to create an ensemble of musical instruments. This work, titled Disarm, has been displayed in art galleries and used in musical performances around the world. And I have a brief clip of him talking about his work that I'd like you to listen to now.
I believe that anything can become material for art. This is one of the many workshops that I've been doing where we turn weapons into instruments. Something that was designed to kill, how will it produce sounds for music? Doing these workshops as an attempt to transform not only the material metal, but also to try to create a psychological transformation and hopefully a social transformation. Because we need to get rid of all the weapons that are entering our territory from the United States. I studied architecture, although I always wanted to be an artist. And it's interesting because in architecture, you learn to solve problems to a degree that often it's hard for me to think just art for art's sake.
This is the kind of fresh thinking that is possible when we put aside the notion that war and weapons are necessary and inevitable. One of the important messages that comes out of Reyes's work is that it is not enough simply to denounce weapons. You have to show what might be done instead. You have to envision a different future. This gun could be an agricultural tool that produces plants. This gun could be a musical instrument that brings joy to people. The next slide, please. That kind of vision was shown in Janesville, Wisconsin. In 1992, a hate group held a rally in Janesville, and it shook up the residents enough that they felt the need to respond, and they did so by creating a peace park that was incorporated into the city park. Collaborating with local Native American groups, the park was dedicated on September 11th, 2002, in a ceremony where the Bad River tribe presented their national flag to the park, and the Seven Springs All Nations Drum Group played. Next slide, please. In 2000, that's okay. In 2005, they added a 51-foot high peace pole. The park makes explicit reference to the UN's 6 key values of peace: respect for life, rejection of violence, sharing with others, listening to understand, preserving the planet, and rediscovering solidarity. At the dedication ceremony, Mike Morris, the development coordinator for the park, said, "Our goal for Peace Park always was and still is to promote peace and unity in the community by giving our children the chance to learn about cultural diversity as they play. If children play together now, they work together later." So I hope that all of this has given you some food for thought about what fills our public spaces and the messages that we find there. And maybe you will be proactive in considering how we can offer messages of peace and justice in our public spaces that will resist the dominant narrative that values war and violence. Thank you.